Hello, I'd like to welcome you to our very first show, The Capital Connection, and I hope you'll be joining us for all of our future shows. I'm Kathy Crawford, State Representative for the 38th District, which serves Novi Township, the Oakland County portion of Northville, also Walled Lake, the city of South Lyon, and Lyon Township. So the goal of the Capital Connection show is to provide information as well as interesting topics from guest presenters that maybe you haven't heard from before. So it's only fitting that my very first topic is the Michigan State Capitol, one of the most beautiful capitals, I think, in the entire United States, but we're going to be talking about our capital in Lansing. I have today guest presenter Matt Van Acker, who knows more about the Capitol than anyone in Lansing, I think, and probably anyone in the state. So he is the Capitol Tour and Information Service Director for the Capitol and has been there since the Engler administration, around 30 years, something like that. And Matt, I want to welcome you to the very first show, Capital Connection. So I know that there's an awful lot that we can talk about, but I thought first we should maybe start a little bit with Michigan history and how we even came to have a capital, and maybe was it just all Indians and fur traders in the area? Can you give us an idea what went on?
Yeah, first I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm pleased to be here, and it's a real honor. And I need to backtrack a little bit. There are a number of other experts in Lansing that probably know as much or more than I do about the Capitol. I appreciate your introduction, though. It was a very kind introduction. I've had the pleasure of working in the building since it was restored. I started working there shortly after the restoration. And to talk about its history, you have to, as you mentioned, kind of start with early statehood history. Michigan had met every requirement for statehood by 1835. We'd had 60,000 inhabitants. We'd passed the state constitution in 1835. We'd elected our first governor, Stevens T. Mason, who was known as the boy governor, his nickname, which I'm
He was only, how old was he?
He was 19.
19 years of age as our first governor.
He served as the secretary of the state at the age of 19, and then was elected as the first governor at the age of 24. To my knowledge, he still holds the national record for being the youngest elected governor.
Wow.
Yeah, most states, including Michigan, you have to be 30 to be governor now. But we'd met every requirement for statehood with the exception
in
1835. Yeah, which was 2 years before we were finally allowed to enter the Union. What held up our entry was a disputed border with the state of Ohio.
We actually had a little skirmish, didn't we?
We did.
With Ohio?
Michiganians refer to it as the Toledo War.
Toledo War.
The Toledo War. Ohio claimed the Toledo land strip, and so did Michigan. And I have to say, from the records I've seen, Michigan had a pretty strong claim to the Toledo land strip.
Well, what would be the Toledo land strip?
Well, it would have gone all across the southern border of the state, or the northern border of Ohio, just a little south of there. Getting Toledo as a part of the state of Michigan was important because it was a port city. The problem was Ohio was already a state and had a very strong claim to the Toledo land strip, including the city of Toledo. And they had representation in Congress, which was even more important because the dispute ended up being settled in Congress.
Was there actually a war?
Well, Mason at one point organized a state militia and actually did send them south to the border with Ohio. And
so now we're fighting with Ohio for different
over
reasons.
Other issues.
Football.
Yeah, some people claim that's where the rivalry started, sort of,
Maybe.
between Michigan and the state of Ohio and the Buckeyes. But as I mentioned, they ended up settling the dispute in Congress, and Ohio got Toledo. That's why it's called Toledo, Ohio, and not Toledo, Michigan. But Michigan got the western part of the Upper Peninsula in the exchange, and it's been argued.
I have heard before we were a state, we actually had a capital in a different location, and it was Detroit. Is that correct?
We did. The first state constitution that I alluded to earlier passed in 1835. Part of it, there was a stipulation within the Constitution that Michigan would have to have a permanent site picked for the capital 10 years down the road by 1847. Detroit was always intended to be the temporary location, which
So
really
I understand
surprises
from reading
people.
too, they moved around different various locations in the city of Detroit.
Bit. Well, they moved
meetings?
eventually. Their final location was the old courthouse in Detroit, the corner of Griswold and State Streets, and that was used as the territorial capital and then as the state capital for the first 10 years, from 1837 to 1847. Huge debate over
I can only imagine
relocating.
that everybody wanted their little municipality,
certainly
their little
did.
community to be the capital,
They certainly
right?
did. And there were a lot of legislators and speculators, land speculators, that were really pushing hard for their location to be picked as the capital city, because they recognized a huge amount of money would come with that. If you had purchased property ahead of
Oh, I
time
see.
in that
Sure.
area, you could sell it to the state and hopefully make a tidy profit on it. So almost every city of any substantial size in Michigan was vying in this.
Marshall, I've always heard Marshall was one of the ones in Ann Arbor.
Yeah,
We're right
definitely.
up there
Yeah.
for wanting the capital to be in their community.
They certainly were.
And I think Marshall even had a building erected, or maybe it was already existing,
They
that
did.
was to be the state capital,
They did.
right?
You know your history very well. They
Not
built
really,
what they
but-
built was a governor's residence in
what it
anticipation of Marshall being picked as the capital city. No sitting governor ever occupied the residence, even though it's still there.
I've been on tours recently, though, where they still are calling that
Yeah,
the,
they
the
do.
capital or the governor's
Yeah,
residence.
In fact, it's located on Capitol Hill, which is a very slight incline in the city of Marshall, where this residence was built. It's run by the Daughters of the American Revolution now, the Marshall chapter, and they do a very nice job of taking care of it. But again, Lansing ended up being picked, and people.
But it wasn't even called Lansing then, was it?
No, it was
Just
called
wild open.
It really was Michigan,
Wild
Michigan.
wilderness.
It was called at the time.
Michigan,
And it was
Michigan.
Michigan. Yeah, and it was the middle of what they termed the howling wilderness.
The howling.
The howling wilderness. And so people have said, well, if there was nothing there, why was it picked as the capital city? And the story of Lansing really develops after it was named as the state capital. It's a story of a city sort of sprouting up from a wilderness.
Is there any evidence as to why it was called Lansing when they
It was
thought of it?
named after John Lansing, who was a war hero, a Revolutionary War hero, which was actually, technically it was named after Lansing, New York. Lansing, New York was named after John Lansing. Some of the early settlers in Lansing, Michigan were from Lansing, New York. So they
really?
named it Lansing, Michigan eventually in honor of their settlement in New York. But I mean, the competition was fierce. And I said, people wondered why Lansing if there was nothing there. The main reason was because no one really wanted to pick Lansing. I know that sounds
Well,
kind
it
of
was central, though,
counterintuitive.
right? They thought it was central to the state.
It was, and that was important.
And then they could avoid all the continuing debate about I want it here, I want it there.
Exactly.
Nobody
Yeah.
was fighting for this.
Exactly,
property, I
exactly. And there weren't people that were really pushing for it to be picked as the capital city. And there's almost a comical correspondence I've read that in a debate that took place in the legislature in Detroit when they were debating, the site of the capital city. At one point, it was during the winter session, and one of the legislators, a correspondent, mentioned that it had snowed the day before, and they thought that maybe the snow would help the legislation slide through the legislature because they were having so much trouble, picking a site. And they ended up kind of picking Lansing as the compromise. Part of the benefit of having Lansing as the capital city, too, is that it was farther away from the border with the British. And people sort of forget about this part of the story. This is not too long after the War of 1812. The city of Detroit had been surrendered to the British during that war. So people were really concerned about the proximity of our capital with the border with the enemy, the British. And fortunately, the Brits are wonderful allies of ours now, but back then, you have to remember the history. They were still considered as a threat. In fact, that's detailed in our state coat of arms. In Latin, it says tuibor which means I will defend. And we, in fact, were defending Michigan against the coming British invasion.
I know. So we decided on the territory that we bought the land, or the state committed funds for the land, and I'm sure they bought a lot of acreage, right?
Yeah.
And then how did they choose an architect? I mean, was there a contest? I've read somewhere where there was a contest.
There was. And if I could, just real briefly to talk about the state purchasing the property, there's another really interesting story about right after the legislation was passed, the speculators basically flocked to the land office.
To buy.
It was actually in Marshall, Michigan, to buy up the hunks of property, and so they could, again, sell them back to the state. And many of them had come to do that, but what they didn't know was that the land agent for the state had made it here before them. And he got into Marshall, the land office was closed, but he knew where the land agent, where the officer in charge of the land office lived. So he went to his home and actually set up the purchase at his home. And the next morning when the land office opened, all these speculators were waiting in line to buy property that the state had already
even then
purchased.
There was scheming going on about property.
There really was.
My goodness.
Yeah, so when they first moved to Lansing, they moved into a temporary building, which sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, sort of Capitol histories.
So it was all wood?
Yeah, it was a small wooden structure, and it was intended to be temporary. The state ended up using it for 30 years.
Did we keep any boards or anything?
You know, it burned down, sadly. After our current Capitol was built,
nothing
in fact,
they could
the other two capitals both burned.
Save.
I think they were able to salvage some furniture, but it was part of the problem with the way those buildings were heated and lit. They were very volatile. They started on fire very easily, and so it was shortly after the current Capitol was built, those other two buildings burned down. So we have bits and pieces of furniture that survived.
So I suspect then we decided, okay, if we're going to build a permanent building, it needs to be fireproof, right? It needs to be stone or something. We don't want to go through the fire thing anymore.
So the legislature, the plan was to build the new permanent Capitol. Very quickly, the Civil War intervened, and it took all of our and money, all of our manpower and money to fight the war effort.
I don't think many people realize how important Michigan was in the Civil War, correct?
It really was. We had a population in Michigan at the time of the war, just prior to the start of the war, 1860 census, about 750,000. We sent 90,000 soldiers. Wow. It's said that 1 in 2 eligible males living in Michigan fought in the Civil War.
1 in 2 eligible males?
Eligible males.
Wow.
Just an incredible sacrifice they made. Part of this story is of the Capitol, a huge part of it is connected to the Civil War. One of the reasons they wanted a fireproof building was to have a fireproof place to store what they termed the relics from the war, including the battle flags that our Michigan soldiers had fought.
Explain, because I think that is so interesting, the battle flags, and I know I've attended a seminar that you did before about the flags, and it's fascinating to me. I guess I didn't have an understanding of, I just thought it was a symbol, but there really was a logical explanation as to why every division or whatever had a flag.
Yeah.
So
this may be a whole different program that we do if you get me started on flags.
I know.
But the flags were there as an inspiration to the men. Many of the regiments, and a regiment, infantry regiment in the Civil War was about 1,000 men, 10 companies of 100 men. So they were there to inspire the men, but they were there logistically too. These were Napoleonic tactics during the Civil War, literally lines of armed men marching against other lines of armed men. In order for you to keep your alignment on the battlefield, you had to have a marker. You had to have something you could visibly see, and the battle flags.
Otherwise, you wouldn't even know
you
where your army was,
exactly.
Right?
You wouldn't know if your regiment was supposed to advance or to retreat or to stand their ground. So the flags were hugely important, logistically on the battlefields. The men knew that if the flag bearer took his staff out of his holster and planted it in the ground, that they had to rally around that flag and protect the flag and to defend their position on the battlefield. So these flags
I guess I always thought they carried the flag.
They did, They had them in holsters that kind of went around their shoulders, and
the flag bearer really didn't carry a weapon?
No,
They just
no,
carried
it
the
was,
flag.
yeah,
right?
they were really not able to carry weapons. A few of them carried sidearms, would carry pistols to defend themselves. There was a whole group of men within one company whose job it was to defend the flag bearer and to make
To
sure
protect, yeah.
to protect
Okay.
them. Now the Confederates recognized the surest way to dishearten the Union troops and to confuse them would be by dropping the colors, or even better, capturing the Union flags. And it was a
So if
really,
you captured the other army's flag, that was, then the army was sort of in
disarray.
chaos.
Yeah, it really was. They would lose their alignment and not really know what they were supposed to do. So during the Civil War, it became a very deadly game of capture the flag.
No
which
cell
is,
phones, no
no cell
telephones.
phones. I mean, this was how they communicated,
Yeah.
to the regiments. The colonel's order would go through his flag bearer. So these flags became really important to the men, logistically, but also emotionally. Some of these flags had literally been presented to them.
Who made the flags?
Some of them were homemade. Some of them were made by the ladies of the communities. We have a beautiful flag in our collection that was hand embroidered by a lady in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
So we actually know who made flags?
Maggie Ferguson was her name. And then we had other flags that were depot flags. They'd be ordered through Army depots and then supplied to the regiment. It's more of kind of a generic flag. We had flag companies. Tiffany was a company that actually produced flags during the Civil War. We have some beautiful...
The same Tiffany that we all know?
Same Tiffany that
Really?
we know, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, they
goodness.
made flags or contracted out to make flags during the war. So to
The
bring
flags
it
were,
back...
we wanted to put flags on display,
We did,
right?
we did. We wanted to display them, and we wanted to have a fireproof place to store them. And some of the earliest recollections of when the Capitol first opened on a very snowy day in January of 1879, January 1st, were the Civil War veterans who'd come to see this
really?
grand building that had been constructed. They'd waited 6 years for the Capitol to be built. It was a 6-year project. They came to see the building, but in my mind too, of the big reason a lot of them came, the veterans anyway, was to see their battle flags again. We have stories of the gray bearded gentlemen pressing their faces up against the glass cases
Really?
and actually coming to tears at the
Oh my
sight,
goodness.
sight of the battle flags that they'd fought. And
How many
seen.
battle flags do we have from
We have
Michigan regiments?
240 flags
That
in
many?
our collection. About 160 are Civil War, and the remainder are Spanish-American War and World War I flags. But they were all housed in the Capitol, and again, a big part of that, the construction of the building, was to have a fireproof place to keep them.
Because just like the Smithsonian, I know you would have to protect them from the elements, even indoors. The light would really be hard for them, right?
Yeah, and there was,
Temperature?
going back that time, they didn't really, I don't think, have an appreciation for how to properly preserve relics. So they originally were kept in a military museum down the South Hall, the first floor. In 1908, 1909, the flags were moved out to the rotunda cases, and I saw them as a child when I was 4 years old and visited the Capitol for my first time. And you could see the bits and pieces of flags hanging from the staffs that they'd been carried into battle on. Worse than that, though, they were finding bits and pieces of flags lying on the bottoms of the cases. They were starting to fall apart. So part of the restoration of our Capitol, and getting ahead in the story a little bit, was to start a project that I co-chair to properly care for that flag collection. The flags were actually removed from the building, and they're at the care of the Historical Museum now.
Are there some on display now?
We
at
have
our
one.
Historical Museum?
We've kind of got the best of both worlds right now at the museum. We have them in a special archival storage facility where we can control, as you mentioned, the light, which is very detrimental to flags.
Temperature too,
temperature,
really affects.
Humidity is controlled. Gravity. Just the weight of the flags was kind of
about
pulling them
gravity.
apart. So we put them on pallets, acid-free pallets. So each flag is laid on its own shelf.
Is there
if you
a
will.
time then when you would change out the flags so that you'd be able to see more?
Yeah, so we rotate. We have a window cut into that storage facility at the museum that's accessible to the public, that goes through the museum. So when you're going there, you can actually see at least one flag at a time. We pull a flag off of its shelf and put it on in front of the viewing window so people can see that. We rotate it monthly, so we have a different flag out every month.
Is there a favorite flag that
Oh
you know?
boy, people have asked me that, and Sometimes it'd be almost like asking me which of my 4 children I like best. They're all incredible. And they all have wonderful,
story,
sad,
right?
incredible stories to tell of the men who fought and died beneath them. Just incredible acts of courage.
I never had much appreciation for flags because I didn't really understand the story.
Sure.
So I just thought, oh, it's just a bunch of flags,
Yeah.
I never really knew what all was behind it.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, every flag that would have a story, there's like a library of information with all those flags,
There
right?
is. And that's part of what our job is, with say the flags, is to document that and to make sure that the stories aren't forgotten, and more importantly that the men aren't forgotten. We can take care of these battle flags, that's important, but to me almost more important is preserving the memory of the men who fought and died beneath them.
Are there other artifacts from the Civil War that are at the Historical Museum along with the flags?
There are. In fact, the Capitol, when it first opened in 1879, had a wonderful military museum in the first floor South Hall. A lot of people don't realize we had an armory in the Capitol.
An armory?
An armory, an arsenal on the
So
the
that if
ground
we needed
floor.
to get guns, they would be there?
We had ammunition, muskets, Gatling guns, artillery pieces, and the remnant of that is still sort of there in the exterior of the building. There's a double door entry in the southwest side of the Capitol, and it's the only double door ground floor entry like that, and it was actually into the arsenal, so they could pull their heavy guns in.
The cannons that are up there?
The cannons and the Gatling guns and things like that. In fact, shortly after the Capitol opened, there were 2 10-pound Parrott rifles that were positioned very prominently at the front of the building, sort of guarding the entries to the main entry of the Capitol. Wow. And they were used by the Loomis Battery, which was a very famous battery, an artillery battery from Michigan. Cyrus Loomis was from Coldwater and led his men with great distinction during the war. When the Capitol was built, by legislative act, they placed 2 of the Loomis guns. A battery was 6 guns. They took 2 of the guns and placed them.
Do we still have those guns?
Well, sadly not. Our last recollection of them is that they were probably thrown into the scrap metal drive in World War II. They got a little overzealous when they were putting things in. We do, though, if I can put a little plug in, we do have an ongoing project right now that is coming to completion.
To restore?
We've made replicas of both of them. In fact, Senator Kowal has been a huge part of this,
yes.
and Senator Steve Beadle, and a number of other folks, and they've raised the funds to replicate those guns, and we'll be placing them August 8th.
August 8th of this year?
This year, yeah. We'll have
Wow.
a ceremony at the Capitol on that day. It's a Saturday.
Is there still a fundraising effort going on?
I think it's still ongoing. It's still ongoing, but I think they're fairly close to reaching their goal of having them.
How did they? I mean, were there plans somewhere so they knew how to build a replica
well,
of that gun?
we know what they look like, and there's a company actually. I've been involved in this project.
It's a cannon, right?
Yeah, yeah. There are two cannons, 10-pound, referring to the weight of the shell that they discharged. 10-pound Parrott rifles they're referred to. And we have actually a company in Ashland, Kentucky that makes replicas, and they make them for the National Park Service. So they'll be exact replicas.
So they really have researched and they know exactly what they look like and everything.
In fact, the stone mounts on the grounds are still there. Part of my job every summer, I go out 2 or 3 times a summer to clear the grass off from the stone mounts that are still there from the original guns. So
now, we're
excited about it.
Will these guns actually fire?
Well, we debated about that. These will be non-firing replicas.
Because I remember when the inauguration of the governor, when they fired the cannons, the windows at the Capitol were shaking. I can only imagine what the people that live in the surrounding area were thinking, like, what's going on? But I mean, I've got to believe that kind of vibration is not good for our Capitol.
We're hoping to, we have to get approval for this yet, but we're hoping to do some live firing with some reenactment batteries that have shown an interest in attending the ceremony.
I'd like to, I know that the building came first and then the grounds.
Yeah.
And in our next segment, we're going to be talking a little bit about, we're going to take people sort of on a tour of the Capitol, because that's what you really know best. But I'm wondering about the grounds. I know I especially love the catalpa tree, which I think we have the largest living catalpa tree in the entire nation. Is that right?
Close. We did actually.
One
just
grew bigger than ours?
Well, a few years ago, a tree down in Indiana beat us out for the title, sadly. And
wow.
Our catalpa is older than the Capitol. It was on the grounds to the building when it was under construction.
First?
We date it probably at least 150 years old.
Was it a native catalpa? Was it a native tree? Or?
Yeah, it was.
Really?
You know, catalpas, you don't see them very frequently anymore. They're huge leaves, cigar pods that they have.
They call them
cigar pods because they look sort of like a cigar. Beautiful white blossoms in the spring. They blossom a little bit later than the rest of the trees, but it's just a gorgeous tree. And the reason you don't see too many of them is they had properties similar to cedar. They didn't rot easily. And so the farmers, they were very popular with Michigan farmers because they made excellent fence posts. And they cut a lot of the catalpas down to turn them into fence posts.
Because they were straight.
Exactly,
and
they didn't rot. And to have a catalpa like that on the grounds of the building is just pretty incredible. And for years, we were listed as a national champion, a grand champion by the
maybe ours
the Big
will have
Tree
a growth
Association.
Or something.
Well, you know, the problem with ours is it splits fairly close to the ground. And in order to get an accurate measurement, the way they measure these grand champions is by its girth, by its circumference at the trunk. They measure that 5 feet up from the ground. Ours splits a little before that, and so they can't measure it from the actual trunk. They'd have to measure the separate split part
that's
of the
one
tree.
I'm only, I mean, I understand too there were Victorian gardens planted, and so this spring, if people go to the Capitol, they would really enjoy seeing all of the blossoms, and there's something that would be blooming year-round, correct?
Yeah, that's true. They were specially designed to match the Victorian idea of carpet bedding, and we do them in designs of beautiful scroll patterns. We have a group of really dedicated volunteers that come out and help our staff, and we plant them. It's always done in one day, and typically, depending on how many volunteers we get, usually in a couple of hours we'll plant the grounds, and all the flowers are donated by
there's lots
growers.
to see around the outside now, and in our next segment, which we're going to have to move to our next segment here shortly, but we're going to talk about the building itself, and then we'll try to pick up some of the interesting things, maybe statues about the outside. So right now, unfortunately, we have to end this part of it.
Definitely.
But I'm hoping that people will join us with our next show, when we're going to be talking about the Capitol itself and all the unique features of one of the most beautiful capitals in the entire, well, I think the United States. I've been in a lot of capitals, and I think ours really is, the restored Capitol is beautiful as it should be. So thank you, Matt, for joining me today. I appreciate you being our very first Capitol Connection show. It only makes sense, the Capitol, it's what we're talking about. So I hope you all will join us for the next segment, the next show, when we talk about the Capitol itself, and we'll take you on a little tour of every floor of the Capitol. Thanks for joining us.